At this point, we will be discussing the first step of the accounting process or the first step of the accounting cycle, and that is journalizing transactions. Before journalizing, transactions are first identified, analyzed, and measured. By identifying, we have to determine whether the transaction is accountable or not. A transaction is accountable if it affects the accounting elements, which are the assets, the liabilities, and the owner's equity. If the transaction is accountable, then it will be recorded in the books of accounts, and if it is not, then it will be disregarded, meaning to say it will not be recorded in the books of accounts. Take note also that when identifying transactions, it must be based on the source documents like official receipts, sales invoices, purchase orders, checks, and etc. When analyzing business transactions, we have to consider ourselves as the business. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we receive? So this is for the debit, and what do we parted with, which is for the credit. By measuring, we have to determine the peso equivalent of the exchange. Single entry versus double entry system of bookkeeping. Under the single entry bookkeeping system, only transactions involving cash and personal accounts are recognized. So this is often used by small businesses. The double entry system of bookkeeping, on the other hand, recognizes the twofold effects of a transaction: the value received or the debit, and the value parted with or the credit. And this is what is used in the accounting practice. The books of accounts are records that are used and kept by the business in storing all of the accounting data. These books of accounts allow the accountants in pursuing smoothly the primary objective of accounting, which is communicating through financial statements. The books of accounts consist of two books: the book of original entry, which is called journal, and the book of final entry, which is called ledger. The book of original entry or journal is where transactions are recorded for the first time. So this is basically used when journalizing transactions. It has two kinds: the general journal and the special journal. The book of final entry or ledger, on the other hand, is where transactions that were recorded in the journal are transferred for final recording. So this is used when posting. It has also two kinds: the general ledger and the subsidiary ledger. So this is what general journal looks like. You can buy it in loose leaf or yung by piece. You may also buy this in book-bound form or yung parang notebook siya. Let's take a closer look on the general journal. So as you can see, the general journal is consist of different columns and rows. So here in this portion is the date column. So the date column shows the date when the transaction took place. The larger part is for the year, and then here would be the month, and then the date. The next column, which is also the largest one, is for particulars. So this column shows the items or the accounts debited and credited as a result of transaction analysis. And it also shows the brief explanation that describes the transaction. The next column is for the folio. So that's why we have letter F. F stands for folio. The word folio is actually a Latin word which means page. So the folio column shows the number of account in a ledger or page of a ledger to which it was transferred. So this is actually used when doing the posting, which is the second step in the accounting cycle. So we will be discussing about the folio as we go on the posting. The next column is the debit column. So this is a money column wherein it shows the peso amount of the value received in the transaction. The last column is also a money column for the credit. So it shows the peso amount of the value parted with in a transaction. Okay, there are those general journals that still have another money column, and that is intended for the balance. But here in our course, we're going to use the debit and credit only. We don't need the balance column. And we have here an illustration of Davao Laundry Services. So this is a service concerned business, and we will be using this illustration all throughout the accounting cycle. So again, we will be concentrating on service concerned business for the meantime. We have here the chart of accounts of Davao Laundry Services. So as you can see, the chart of accounts contains different account titles that are going to be used to describe a transaction. And then these account titles are arranged in a specific order, starting off with the balance sheet accounts and then the income statement accounts. The balance sheet accounts is also arranged starting off with the assets and then followed by the liabilities and then the owner's equity. And then for income statement accounts, it will start with the income and then followed by the expenses. If a certain transaction involves an account title which could not be found here in the chart of accounts, the accountant or the bookkeeper may add a new account title to the chart of accounts. Okay, so now we will start the journalizing process, and let's start with the first transaction, which is on March 1, 2019. On that date, Mr. Severo Santos opens a current account with Allied Banking Corporation in the amount of 850,000 pesos to start with his laundry shop business under the trade name Davao Laundry Services. So, on that date, March 1, 2019, Davao Laundry Services is created, which is separate and distinct from the owner, Mr. Severo Santos, which means the 850,000 pesos amount is no longer owned by Mr. Severo Santos. It is now owned by Davao Laundry Services. Before going on to the transaction analysis, I would like to remind you with the rules when analyzing business transactions. So remember to analyze the transactions at the viewpoint of the business and always consider yourself as the business. So I think we're ready. So we will now start the transaction analysis. So here in this transaction, what do we receive? It's cash of 850,000 pesos. In the chart of accounts of Davao Laundry Services, we have cash account, which is the cash in bank account. And this is the appropriate account title to be used since the cash of 850,000 is deposited in the bank. So our debit entry would be cash in bank of 850,000. So here in the general journal, we will write page number 1 since this is the first general journal that we are using for the recording. And then for the date column, we will write here the year 2019 because the first transaction happens in the year 2019. And then particulars, folio, then debit and credit. Okay, so here in the month column, we're going to write Mar. So we're going to abbreviate it to make it short. So Mar for March. And date is 1. Okay, so here in particulars, we will now write the debit entry. We have cash in bank. So we're going to leave folio because as I said, folio will be used in the posting. So we go straightly to the money columns. Since we are still in the debit entry, so the amount of 850,000 is written also in the debit money column. So we have here 850,000. So when writing amounts in the money columns, you have to begin in the right part and then going to the left. For our credit entry, what do we parted with in order to get the cash in bank of 850,000? It is the ownership interest of Mr. Severo Santos on the business. And this one is represented in the account title as Santos Capital. So our credit entry would be as Santos Capital of 850,000 pesos. In the particulars column of our general journal, we will write our credit item or our credit entry. So we have as Santos Capital. So make sure that the credit item is indented from the debit item. So S Santos Capital is also 850,000 pesos. So as I said earlier, when writing amounts in the money columns, you'll begin with the right and then going to the left. So you are going to write first the 0, 0, 0, 0, and then 5, and then 8. Okay, so after the credit entry, we will provide a brief description of the transaction, a brief description or an explanation of the transaction. And make sure that it is also indented from your credit item. So our explanation is to record initial investment, or we can shorten it into initial investment. And this is now the opening entry of Davao Laundry Services. So it is called opening entry because this is the first entry in the general journal. We will now proceed to the second transaction. So this is on March 2, 2019. Purchase laundry supplies on account 90,000 from the following suppliers. We have SMCT Davao 35,000 pesos, Gaisano Mall 25,000 pesos, NCCC Mall 30,000 pesos. So the total payable is 90,000 pesos. So for debit entry, what do we receive in this transaction? We received laundry supplies. In the chart of accounts of Davao Laundry Services, we have this account title, Laundry Supplies. And we're going to use this account title in recording our debit entry on March 2, 2019. So, our debit entry on March 2, 2019 is laundry supplies of 90,000 pesos. Let us now write our debit entry in the general journal. So, we will write the date, which is 2. So take note that we are no longer writing the month, which is March, because the second transaction happens within the same month, which is March. And take note also that we are skipping one row before we begin recording our second transaction. Okay, so we are going to write now our debit item, which is the laundry supplies. And then the amount is 90,000 pesos. Okay, now for our credit entry, what do we parted with in order to get the laundry supplies of 90,000 pesos? So, the laundry supplies are acquired on account, meaning to say, utang pa siya, hindi pa siya bayad. So, there is an oral promise to pay of 90,000 pesos. It's an oral promise to pay since there is no promissory note involved. So, the appropriate account title to be used in the transaction is accounts payable. Okay, so our credit entry would involve accounts payable of 90,000 pesos. So we will write it now in the general journal. And remember to make sure that your credit entry or credit item is indented from your debit item. So we have here accounts payable, and then we have the amount 90,000 pesos. This is to record laundry supplies on credit. Let's now move on to the third transaction, which is on March 3, 2019. Purchased of laundry machine for cash, 150,000 pesos. So in this transaction, what do we receive? We received laundry machine of 150,000 pesos. So here in the chart of accounts of Davao Laundry Services, we don't have laundry machine account title, but we do have laundry equipment. So this is the most appropriate account title to be used in the transaction. Our debit entry is laundry equipment of 150,000 pesos. So let us now write it in our general journal. So we will skip one row before writing this next transaction. So we have it here. So the date is 3, which is March 3. So our debit entry or debit item is laundry equipment, and then the amount is 150,000 pesos. Now for our credit entry, what do we parted with? It's a cash of 150,000 pesos. And since we only have cash in bank account, so we're going to use the cash in bank account. So this is the most appropriate account title to be used. So our credit entry again would be cash in bank of 150,000 pesos. Okay, so we will write it in the general journal. So don't forget to indent our credit entry from the debit entry, which is laundry equipment. So here we have cash in bank, the amount of which is 150,000 pesos. So this is to record the purchase of machine for cash. We will now proceed to the next transaction, which is on March 4, 2019. Rendered laundry services on account for 80,000 pesos to the following customers. Apo View Hotel, 5,000 pesos. Grand Menseng Hotel, 35,000 pesos. The Marco Polo Hotel, 30,000 pesos. And then the Royal Mandaya Hotel, 10,000 pesos for a total receivable of 80,000 pesos. So in this transaction, what do we receive? Okay. Take note that here in this transaction, si Davao Laundry Services rendered its laundry services on account, meaning to say, utang, hindi pa bayad. So, hindi pa bayad yung services na binigay ni Davao Laundry Services, which means si Appleview Hotel ay may utang kay Davao Laundry Services ng 5,000 pesos. Si Grand Menseng Hotel ay may utang kay Davao Laundry Services ng 35,000 pesos. The Marco Polo Hotel may utang na 30,000 pesos. Royal Mandaya Hotel ay may utang din na 10,000 pesos. So, in total, meron itong 80,000 pesos. So, here, what do we received is the right to collect the 80,000 pesos. The transaction didn't mention that the customers issued a promissory note. So, therefore, the appropriate account title to be used for this receivable is accounts receivable. Okay, so our debit entry would be accounts receivable of 80,000 pesos. So here in our general journal, we're going to write the date, which is 4 for March 4. So we have here a debit entry, accounts receivable of 80,000 pesos. Next, what do we ported with in order to get the accounts receivable of 80,000 pesos? So it's the services rendered that is also worth 80,000 pesos. So on our part, or on the part of Davao Laundry Services, it's an income. So the appropriate account title to be used would be laundry income. So our credit entry is laundry income of 80,000 pesos. So here in the general journal, we're going to record the laundry income of 80,000 pesos. So make sure to indent the laundry income from the accounts receivable. So this is to record laundry services on credit. So next transaction on March 10, 2019, paid taxes and licenses due to government 4,000 pesos. So what do we receive in this transaction? It's an expense, which is the taxes and licenses amounting to 4,000 pesos. So looking into the chart of accounts of Davao Laundry Services, the appropriate account title to be used would be taxes and licenses. So our debit entry would be taxes and licenses of 4,000 pesos. So we're going to write it in the general journal. So we're going to write the date. It's 10 for March 10. So our debit is taxes and licenses, the amount of which is 4,000 pesos. So what do we parted with? So in this transaction, it says payment of taxes and licenses, meaning to say there is a reduction in cash or there is an outflow of cash as a result of payment of taxes and licenses. And as you notice here in this illustration of Davao Laundry Services, the account title used for cash transactions is cash in bank. So our credit would be cash in bank of 4,000 pesos. So this is the record payment of taxes and licenses. And make sure to make indentions. So indent your credit entry from your debit entry. That's why cash in bank is indented from the debit entry of taxes and licenses. And then the explanation is indented from the credit entry of cash in bank. Next transaction on March 12, 2019, Mr. Severo Santos withdrew 10,000 pesos cash from the business for his personal use. Okay, so what do we receive in this transaction? It's the reduction of Severo's capital in the form of drawing or withdrawal. So here in the chart of accounts, we have this account title as Santos Drawing. So this is the appropriate account title to describe the withdrawal of Mr. Severo Santos of 10,000 pesos. So our debit entry would be as Santos Drawing of 10,000 pesos. Okay, so we're going to record it in the general journal. So we have to skip one row. And then we'll start writing on the date 12, and then our debit entry is S. Santos Drawing amounting to 10,000 pesos. Now, what do we parted with? Okay, it's the cash in bank of 10,000 pesos. So why cash in bank of 10,000 pesos? So in this transaction, the cash in bank balance of Davao Laundry Services is reduced by the withdrawal of 10,000 pesos of Mr. Severo Santos. And take note that cash in bank is an asset in which its normal balance is debit. So in order to reflect the reduction of cash in bank, so we're going to credit it. So our credit entry would be cash in bank of 10,000 pesos. So this is to record the withdrawal of the owner. Next transaction is on March 17, 2019. The business borrowed money from Allied Banking Corporation, the amount of which is 100,000 pesos, by issuing a 15-day note. It was deposited to the account of Davao Laundry Services by way of a credit memorandum issued by bank. So in this transaction, what do we receive? It's the cash in bank of 100,000 pesos. So if you can recall, in the first transaction of Davao Laundry Services, it says that Mr. Severo Santos opens an account with Allied Banking Corporation. And then here, on March 17, 2019, Davao Laundry Services issued a promissory note in favor of the same bank, which is Allied Banking Corporation. So, because Davao Laundry Services has already an account with Allied Banking Corporation, so what the bank did is that it issued a credit memorandum. So when say credit memorandum, it is automatically deposited to the account of Davao Laundry Services. So that's why we have the debit entry of cash in bank of 100,000 pesos. So we have here the date, it's 17 because it's March 17. Our debit entry would be cash in bank of 100,000 pesos. What do we parted with in order to get the cash in bank of 100,000 pesos? So it's the notes payable, since Davao Laundry Services says that it issued notes payable in favor of Allied Banking Corporation. So our credit entry would be notes payable of 100,000 pesos. So this is to record the issuance of 15-day note for the borrowed money. The next transaction is still on March 17, 2019, and it says that the bank issued a debit memo of 1,000 pesos for interest and bank charges. So what do we receive in this transaction? We receive an expense on interest and bank charges of 1,000 pesos. So since this is an expense, so we're going to check on the chart of accounts of Davao Laundry Services under the expenses portion. And we have this account title, interest expense. So this is the most appropriate account title to use to describe the transaction. So we have here, what do we receive? It's the interest expense of 1,000 pesos. So we're going to write it in our general journal. So we have interest expense of 1,000 pesos. So if you notice, we are no longer writing down the date, since the date and what do we parted with. So the transaction says that the bank issued a debit memo of 1,000 pesos. The debit memo is an opposite of the credit memo. So if the credit memo is an addition to the bank account, or it's an addition because it's a deposit, so therefore the debit memo is a reduction from the bank account. It's a withdrawal. So therefore, the cash in bank balance is reduced by the debit memo of 1,000 pesos. So cash in bank is an asset account. So in order to reduce, we need to credit it. So this is now our credit entry. Cash in bank of 1,000 pesos. So we have it here in the general journal. We have cash in bank credit of 1,000 pesos. So this is to record the payment of bank interest. The next transaction is on March 21, 2019. Receive cash of 45,000 pesos, representing collection from the following customers' account. We have Grand Manseng Hotel, 30,000 pesos. The Marco Polo Hotel, 10,000 pesos. Royal Mandaya Hotel, we have 5,000 pesos for a total collection of 45,000 pesos. So what do we receive in this transaction? Of course, obviously, it's cash. And since here in this illustration for Davao Laundry Services, all the cash transactions are using cash in bank. So our debit entry would be cash in bank of 45,000 pesos. So in the general journal, we will write the date, it's 21, and then our debit entry of cash in bank, the amount of which is 45,000 pesos. So next, what do we parted with? It's the cancellation of the right to collect the 45,000 pesos. Okay, this transaction is actually in relation to the March fourth transaction wherein we have the total receivable of 80,000 pesos. And then here on March 21, we have partial collection, which is 45,000 pesos. So meaning to say, our receivable of 80,000 pesos is reduced by the 45,000 pesos collection. So our previous entry on March 4, it includes a debit entry of accounts receivable. So in order to reduce that accounts receivable by 45,000, we need to credit it. So our credit entry would be accounts receivable of 45,000 pesos. So we're going to write it in our general journal. So we have accounts receivable of 45,000 pesos. So this is to record the partial collection of accounts. Moving on to the next transaction, we have March 25, 2019. So we have partial payment of accounts, 60,000 pesos to the following suppliers. So we have SMCT Davao, 25,000 pesos, Gaisano Mall, 20,000 pesos, NCCC Mall, 15,000 pesos, for a total payable of 60,000 pesos. So what do we received in this transaction? The cancellation of our oral promise to pay for 60,000 pesos. So this transaction is actually in relation to the transaction on March 2, 2019. So if you can still remember, on March 2, 2019, Davao Laundry Services purchased laundry supplies on account for 90,000 pesos. And then here on March 25, 2019, out of the 90,000 pesos total payable on March 2, 2019, the Davao Laundry Services paid 60,000 pesos, so partial payment, which is 60,000 pesos. So, on March 2, our entry includes a credit of accounts payable worth 90,000 pesos. So, for partial payment, we need to cancel the 60,000 pesos portion of the accounts payable. And in order to do that, we need to debit the accounts payable for 60,000 pesos. And so we will now write our debit entry in our general journal. So we'll start with the date, it's 25, and then our debit entry again is accounts payable, the amount of which is 60,000 pesos. So what do we parted with? So obviously it's cash in bank of 60,000 pesos since this is payment of payable. So our credit again is cash in bank 60,000 pesos. So this is the record partial payment of accounts. Next, on March 30, 2019, Mr. Severo Santos hired an accountant or manager for his business as he has plenty of things to attain at 10,000 pesos per month effective April 1, 2019. So this is an example of a non-accountable transaction because it does not affect the accounting elements of Davao Laundry Services. So it does not affect the assets, it does not affect the liabilities, it does not affect the owner's equity of Davao Laundry Services since the effectivity of the accountant or the manager is on April 1, 2019. Next, still on March 30, 2019. The following expenses were paid by Davao Laundry Services for the month of March 2019. Space rental 5,000 pesos, telephone, light and water 20,000 pesos, salaries of employees contractual 10,000 pesos for a total expenses of 27,000 pesos. So what do we received in this transaction? We received various expenses. First, we have space rental of 5,000 pesos. So here in the chart of accounts, the appropriate account title to describe the space rental would be rent expense. So we have here our debit entry, rent expense of 5,000 pesos. So we're going to write it in the general journal. So we have a new general journal since the first one is already full. The page number 1 is already full. So we are now in page number 2. So we're going to write the year 2019 and then the month. Okay, particulars first and then folio, debit, credit. And then we have to write the month, March for March, and then the date, which is 30. And then we're going to write our first debit entry. We have rent expense of 5,000 pesos. Another expense is the telephone, light, and water for 20,000 pesos. So these are utilities. So the appropriate account title to describe this one is utilities expense. So our debit entry, we have utilities expense of 20,000 pesos. Another expense is the salaries. So the appropriate account title to use would be salaries expense. So we have another debit entry of salaries expense of 10,000 pesos. And then what do we parted with in order to get, or what do we parted with in order to pay the expenses? Of course, it's the cash, and we're using the cash in bank. So our credit entry would be cash in bank 27,000 pesos. So this is the record payment of expenses. So this is an example of a compound entry. A compound entry may consist of one debit item and two or more credit items, or it could be two or more debit items and one credit item, which is like this one. It could also be two or more items on both sides. And then the previous entries we have prior to March 30, 2019 are all single entries. It consists of one debit item and one credit item. Another thing, if you guys notice in our journal entries, the debit amount is always equal to the credit amount. Say for example here in this last journal entry of Davao Laundry Services, the credit amount is 27,000 pesos. And then if you're going to total the debit amounts, it will also equal to 27,000 pesos. So 5,000 plus 12,000 plus 10,000, it's 27,000 pesos. So the debit total is now equal to the credit total. So this is the rule of the debit and credit. The debit must always be equal to the credit, or the left must always be equal to the right, or the value received must always be equal to the value parted with.